folks. My name's Gordon, and I like mushrooms. And I'm here to talk to you about mushrooms, but not just mushrooms. I'm going to talk to you about all fungi. And that's something that you may not know, no matter how seasoned of a mushroom hunter you are. You might not realize how much fungi are around us all the time, everywhere, and that's kind of what I'm here to tell you about. So, I like starting my talks with this slide. It's a Arcambolo face. Does anyone know who Arcambolo was? He was a 14th century Dutch painter who made still life faces out of fruit. And they're weird and funny and strange, and I loved them. And I saw a guy who'd been making Arcambolo faces out of whales, cetacean. He was a marine biology student. Chris Oxley is his name. So I reached out to him and I was like, hey man, would you do a face like this but with mushrooms? And he was like, sure, but I don't know diddly squat about mushrooms. I was like, cool, I got you, bro. So I sketched out a face and I had some of the sort of basic ideas of like an aiming head, the Mycena eyes, chicken of the woods cheeks, all that kind of stuff. And I sent him this sort of poorly sketched out rendered drawing and he was like, hey, send me a photo of yourself. And I was like, okay. So I sent him kind of a 3/4 view of my face, and he modeled like the proportions of this on my face. And people have described this as nightmarish, which I don't disagree. But I like it because it really helps to kind of drive home the obsession I have with mushrooms. And it's beyond the fascination, to be totally honest. It is a full-blown obsession, and this is something that started out as kind of a hobby and has just like snowballed into becoming my entire life and personality, which was not what I intended, but is definitely what happened. So. I am going to ask for your consent to info dump on you. And there's a saying at MIT, when MIT freshmen come in, there was this prank they do on campus where they would turn all of the water fountains into fire hydrants. Because the joke was, instead of drinking from a water fountain, you're drinking from a fire hose. So I am going to, in the spirit of MIT, spray you guys with a fire hose of information. But don't worry, there's no test. Just let it soak over you, and whatever sticks, sticks. And if you want to know more, you can get my book. And that's essentially what this presentation is. It's an hour and a half because I'm trying to give you an overview of my book, which I can do in about an hour, but I also want to tell you some stories and let you guys know who I am, which takes an extra half hour. So we'll get through it. Okay, here's a question. Who here is really fascinated by fungi? Hands. That is pretty damn good. Thank you guys. Normally it's like 3 people in the audience, so I don't have to fully explain to you what I do on the internet. And which some of you have probably seen, and I have mixed feelings about what I do on the internet. But I started out a social media account that was just mushrooms, and the idea was I wanted to kind of bridge the gap between aesthetically pleasing mushroom content and science content. As I saw, there's people who posted pretty pictures, but there was not a lot, added contextually or information-wise. And there's people who are really into foraging, but they didn't really have the science. And I was like, I have this background as a PhD biochemist, and I really wanted to kind of like summarize things into something that was like bite-sized and easy to digest. And so I feel like I've done that somewhat successfully because I've grown to almost 3 million followers across all these platforms, which is like an insane number of people who follow mushroom content. And the reason I did it is because I wasn't just being like, hi, here's this mushroom, let me tell you facts about it. I was like, no, I'm going to take the approach of using what I call emotionally evocative educational content. And to give you an example of that for people who haven't seen my stuff, here's a video I did from years ago. It was a St. Patrick's Day compilation. So there's me with a porcini. There's some slime mold pulsing, that's in time lapse. There's a Hydnella chanterelles, another slime mold. There's a jelly fungi, people love that. There's a Piziza cup, a little lichen, more slime mold. Let's see, there's a slug eating a mushroom. Gotta love banana slugs. There's a parrot mushroom. There's more Hydnella. There's some Chloriseboria. There's a microbial. There's some droplets. There's a wing cap, and there's puffballs in your face. So that video has been viewed like 40 million times. And it's wild, like why would people view that 40 million times? That's a lot of times to just watch something over and over and over again. And it's because I didn't put names in there. It's because I didn't try to be like, here's the name of this mushroom. People scroll away from that. Instead, they're just like, God, that was weird. I want to watch it again, right? And there's if anyone recognizes the microbial here, that is a Colorado thing. And there's a little shout out to the people, the Chloriseboria folks in the audience as well. But what started out as just like a humble Instagram channel had like sort of spun out into this giant network, and a lot of it came off of TikTok, which I blew up during COVID because people were stuck inside, and I think they liked being able to sort of get a little taste of being outside. And I was basically, during COVID, I was supposed to be doing a postdoc and writing a paper, and I was just sick of it, and I was going mushroom hunting all the time, so I posted a lot. I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about what my inspirations were, because I think this is one of the questions when you're getting into mushroom stuff. You're like, well, what was your gateway mushroom? What really caught your attention and grabbed you, made you say, I want to learn more? So I had sort of like a biphasic like mushroom thing in my life, in that as a kid, I was really interested. And my earliest memory of a mushroom was up in Lake Tremblant, which is like northern Quebec. My grandparents had a cabin up there, and we'd go and spend a couple weeks in the summer. And my mom and I were walking around the woods, and I saw this like slimy little green mushroom, and I'd seen mushrooms before, but this thing was like slimy and green, and I was like, what the hell is that? Is it an alien? And my mom was like, no, I was 4, but she was like, no, I don't know, let's go ask your granddad. And he was like, oh, that's a parrot mushroom, and I was like, bullshit, it's an alien, and I was 4, so that's that. But I had more experiences. I got around like age 5, my mom and I were on a hike, and we found a puffball. I ate that, and that kind of like soft tofu marshmallow thing like stuck with me for a lifetime, so I remember that. When I was, I don't know, 9, 10, something like that, my dad had a stump in the yard he wanted to get rid of, and he didn't want to pay to get it ground down, so he went online and he ordered some chicken in the woods blood spawn. We plugged up the log. I was super excited, but immediately forgot about it because I was like 9 and had the attention of a goldfish. But a couple years later, out popped this crazy orange and yellow polypore that's all fleshy, and I'm like, Dad, what is this? Can we eat it? And he was kind of like, well, it looks like the pictures in the book, and we literally inoculated the stump, so I think we're probably pretty safe to eat this. And he wanted to wait a few days, and I was like, no, now! And so we brought it in, we cooked it, and it was like, again, another sort of life-changing experience that was like, oh my god, this is so good. And if you've ever had chicken in the woods, it doesn't really taste like chicken. It has kind of this like slightly sour, like woody polypore kind of flavor, but it tastes like whatever you cook it in. So if you fry it up in butter, it does kind of taste like chicken fried in butter. And it has the texture of it is really where you get the chicken thing from, because the meaty texture is so like, oh, it's so good. Especially if it's fresh. Once they get older and they get a little tough, it's no bueno. But when you get a really soft, supple one and you have all the little fibers in it, it is a 1-for-1 with something like chicken breast, and it's killer. There's even parts of it that like, the way it slips almost feels like a little bit like a chicken thigh. It's different from a chicken breast, and that's how you like butcher the polypore. So I ate some truffles and morels as a kid when I was in France, and like I have always been interested in mushrooms because I liked eating them. I am a belly hunter. I want to eat mushrooms. And then I forgot about mushrooms for like 20 years. I think I became like a pimply, anxious pre-teenager and just kind of forgot about the things I thought were cool. I was supposed to go to mushroom foray, and it never happened, and then I just lost the thread. I came back to fungi in grad school, undergrad really, because I was like brewing beer, and yeast was my entry sort of back into fungi as a whole. But it wasn't until I'd finished my PhD and I was living in New Zealand for a little bit, and I was on a hike, and we found this mushroom right here. This kind of, anyone here had a piapini before? This is basically a New Zealand version of a piapini, but I couldn't figure out what the heck it was because it didn't have gills. And I was like, what is this crazy brown mushroom that doesn't have gills? And if you've ever tried to Google brown mushroom without gills on a tree in New Zealand, you are not going to have any luck. Because if you've ever tried to describe a mushroom to any mushroom person, they're like, it's white and sized like a dinner plate. And they're like, stop, I'm not going to figure this out with you. Unless you can tell me the spore color and the gill color and the ornamentation. It's like, it's difficult to be a beginner and try to describe mushrooms because you don't have the language to describe it. So what I ended up doing was I threw this photo on my Instagram. And I was like, hey, does anyone know what this is? And through like a friend of a friend, someone was like, hey, I'd spent time in New Zealand and like compare it with this. And I found it. It was Tawaka or Cyclocide parasitica. And it is basically just the New Zealand version of a piapini. And what I realized is in this photo, the partial veil hadn't dropped. So it has gills. I just didn't know enough about the morphology of a mushroom to know that there was a partial veil there. Instead, I thought it was this weird thing. I didn't know what it was. And that sort of set the stage for me using social media as this like crowdsourcing social tool to learn about mushrooms. So if you scroll all the way back in my Instagram history, you will see this little orange mushroom. It was the very first photo I ever posted. And that was another thing I found in New Zealand that really captured me. So the Tawaka I was interested in because I ate it, and it was delicious. But it was like a whole process of kind of like learning that I should cook it and I should just try a little bit. It was like a lot of caution went into it, but as soon as I realized how tasty it was, I was like in it to be like, oh my god, I'm gonna be foraging. But this little orange mushroom was all over the place, and it was growing on all the dead wood, and I was like, I can't eat this. But you turn it over and it had this beautiful morphology, all those little holes in it. I was like, that looks really cool. And I was, again, trying to figure out what this thing was, found out it was the orange pork conch, or Fabulosa calicera, and it's not from New Zealand. It's an invasive mushroom that came from South Africa. And so that also sort of set me up to think about, wow, there's these like larger ecological things that are at play here that I hadn't fully taken into account or understood in terms of fungi. Because I knew about invasive species, but I hadn't really thought about it in the context of mushrooms. So my entry back into mushrooms was basically like, I want to eat them, and I also want to understand kind of what they are and what they're doing and why they're here. And that is why I became fascinated by fungi. So a little bit about who I am, where I came from. I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts. My folks live on the North Shore. If you've ever seen The Perfect Storm, they're up by Gloucester, Massachusetts, and Rockport. I went to UC Santa Cruz, got a BS in biochemistry. I did some undergrad research on malaria through a Howard Hughes lab. I got really into brewing. I was also doing a lot of scuba and sailing while I was at Santa Cruz because I was by the ocean. But it was my interest in yeast that ended up leading me to apply to UC Davis in biochemistry. And I was hoping to work with a beer guy, but he didn't take PhD students because he's like, there's no jobs for PhDs in beer. So instead I found a woman who was working on wine yeast and got really deep into kind of wine yeast genetics and the ecology of wine fermentations. And then got this whole secondary education like wine tasting, which was wild, that I had no idea I'd be learning that when I went to school, but it was really cool, and I drank a lot of wines that were like way above my station in life. And out of that, I was at Davis for 7 years and sort of said, well, I have this like microbiology, PhD, wine degree, but I've never actually worked in wine. So I ended up working at Opus One Winery, which is a very high-end cult winery. It's like $400+ a bottle, and they had the money to fund some research. So I went in there and I isolated some wild yeast, which they now use for their fermentation. So instead of, they have like, Opus One is kind of a weird cult celebrity wine brand. Basically it was like the Rothschild and Mondavis came together to form this like one place that makes a very expensive wine called Opus One. But they make like 82 different wines that they then blend into one wine. So at one point they were fermenting all 82 wines with the same yeast. Now they have different yeasts that I isolated that correspond to their different vineyard blocks. So when they bring in a vineyard block, they can ferment it with the yeast from that lot. And the idea was to kind of add some extra texture and flavor and like nuance to the final blend. And they're still doing that, so I think I was successful in that. But I also pioneered some new fermentation tech while I was there, which then led to me getting a job with a Bay Area like biotech sales company, because it was the guy I'd been talking to about buying stuff, and he was like, I like the way you talk about science, can I hire you? And I was like, yes, I need a job. So I spent a while going around to a lot of both like big pharmaceutical companies, new age biotech companies like Impossible Foods, which makes that kind of like that vegetarian burger that's all bloody. And then also a lot of like Central Valley like dairy processing and tomato processing places. So I was selling probes and tanks, and I was learning all this stuff about biotechnology and process engineering. But I was getting a little sick of sending emails that were like, hey, I'm just touching base, I'm just checking in, how you feeling on that quote? And I was like, I'm kind of dying inside the more that I try to do sales. So I went back and did some a postdoc at UC Davis. And I was looking at some of the kind of technology I'd been working at Opus One and trying to understand what wine terroir was in this like very kind of deep chemical sense. And then COVID happened and everything kind of like fell apart. I managed to publish from the postdoc, and the sales thing just kind of like ended. And I'd been planning on working in industry for like 5 or 10 years and then pursuing my passion about mushrooms and maybe writing a book. But I was like, it was 21, and I was like, well, do I go back and like suck the corporate teat, or do I actually invest in myself? And I decided to like, I will write a proposal, I will get an agent, and I will do this for real. And I talked to a couple people like Eugenia Bowen and Merlin Sheldrake who were basically like, go for it. And I was like, all right, let's do this. So because of the book deal I got, I was able to transition to being a full-time author, science communicator, and educating people about mushrooms and getting to share my passion, which is something I was excited about, but it was a little nerve-wracking too, because I'm like, I no longer have the structure of a job. I really miss having a W-2. It's weird to be self-employed and trying to do this on your own. But hopefully we're getting there. So outside of mushroom hunting, I like to cook, I like to forage, I garden, I love the ocean, and I like my cat Honey Badger, who's this little orange guy down here sniffing my shiitake. He has eaten my mushrooms on multiple occasions, because a lot of times I'll cook mushrooms and leave them in the pan and kind of go to bed and then eat them in the morning. And I've come out in the morning, he will eat the caps off my mushrooms, but not the stems. Smart cat, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so why the hell did I write a mushroom book? There's so many goddamn mushroom books. What is the point of another one? Well, let me tell you. So the idea of writing Passport was to make something that was a little bit more accessible than a lot of mushroom books, because what do you do with a mushroom book? They're full of great photos, but the descriptions are often kind of hard to understand, and it's like, you know, centimeter cap, and it's all these like weird languages like rugulos and things. You're like, I don't know what these words mean. And all you can really do as a beginner is sit there with a mushroom in your hand and flip through all the pages in the book. And if you don't see the mushroom in your hand, you're like, well, what the hell is this? I have no idea. And so I wanted to write a book that would give you a little bit of a broader sense of how to understand and categorize mushrooms. And I'm hoping I did that. You guys can look at it and tell me what you think. But the idea was to make something that was like really accessible, and there was a ton of photos, there's a ton of illustrations. It covers all the basic kinds of fungi, not just mushrooms. And that's a really important point, is that all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. Thank you. and that's because we, like, roughly there's maybe 150,000 species of mushrooms, and that's in flux depending on what, you know, sequencing nerd you're talking to. But the estimates say there's probably about 2 to 5 million types of fungi total, and a lot of that is still like unknown black book stuff. And so this is me and my attempt to try to understand, how do we understand this kingdom as a whole and put mushrooms in their proper context and understand it all. And I really wanted to dive into not just, you know, mushroom ID, but the biology, the ecology, the biochemistry, all this stuff. And really importantly, I think there's an issue with a bit of a hero worship thing that happens in mycology. Certain people are sort of like elevated to like god status, and it's weird when you're like, I don't feel the way that you feel about them, and like, whatever. So I really wanted to put other mycologists in this book, feature their perspectives, and diverse perspectives too, because it's not just a bunch of guys that look like me. There's a few, specifically Alan is in this book, and if you've met Alan, we do look very similar. But when you've talked to Alan, you know that him and I are very different people. So Alan's in the book, but there's also a lot of other people that are important in my life that have contributed to this as well, and they don't look like me. So the format of the book. First half is all question answer. It's like 10 chapters of what is a mushroom? What is mycelium? What is the difference between fruiting body versus mycelium when it comes to like supplements? There's a lot of stuff in there where I really try to address some of the common questions, because I've done a ton of live streaming and I've found out what people's, you know, most common misconceptions about mushrooms are, and I've done my best to try to address those in a really like systematic and easy to read way, such that you don't have to read cover to cover. You can just jump around, ask a question, get an answer, and they're sort of binned out by different, you know, chapters depending on, is it foraging, is it cooking, is it biochemistry, that kind of stuff. And the second half of the book is a little bit more sort of traditional mushroom profiles, but instead of trying to offer really like precise information about specific species, I decided to do everything in a general sense at the genus level. Because it doesn't really matter if you're in Colorado or Africa or Asia, if you find a chanterelle and you recognize it as a cantharellus, a true chanterelle, you can eat it. Worldwide, those things are edible. And so I don't really want to argue with the nerds about which species it is because I haven't sequenced it. I want people to just say, I feel confident eating this because I know it's a chanterelle. And so in that sense, I try to write things in this general way to make the book more broadly applicable to North America and ideally the world. And then the other thing too is, in every mushroom book, you're limited by the number of photos you can have. And some people have really phenomenal, huge color photos. I opted to go with smaller photos, but every single page in Fungal Profile has a QR code that will link you to that genus on iNaturalist. So you're not dependent on the like 3 or 4 photos I can fit on one page. You can go look at thousands of pictures of a chanterelle and make sure that in case the chanterelle was older or younger, or there's a different morphological thing because of its weird habitat, you can look at thousands of photos and be like, I am absolutely sure. And that's integrated technology-wise into the book. So hopefully that's all a little bit different from other mushroom books you've seen. And now I'm gonna try to just like rip-roaringly take you through the book. And like Mick said, if you have a question, feel free to ask. I don't want to just sermon at you, but I do talk fast, so if you want me to stop and go back to something, raise your hand. Okay, where are fungi and what the hell do they do? Fungi are everywhere, and this is a thing that I think everyone in this room, if you're part of a mycology club, is probably fairly familiar with the idea that fungi are there as nature's decomposers. They're saprotrophs, they're going to break stuff down. They're also mycorrhizal, so they're living in symbiosis with a tree, expanding the network of the tree's ability to access the nutrients and the water that's in the soil, while the tree is giving some carbon to the mushroom. I think everyone is fairly familiar with those concepts. What I didn't realize when I started writing this book, and there was a lot that I learned while doing this, was that fungi are not just on the roots and the dead wood. They're on the surface of a plant as epiphytes. They're inside of the plant as endophytes. They're living kind of like the bacteria that live inside of us as our microbiome. Fungi are part of that plant microbiome. They are in the stratosphere. There's constantly like spores moving all around the world. blowing from continent to continent, sometimes spreading disease, sometimes spreading other stuff. They're in water. There's aquatic fungi everywhere, in pretty much every single aquatic ecosystem on the planet, whether it's a salt marsh or it's a deep sea water vent or it's the ocean or ponds. There's fungi there. They're there at pretty low amounts comparative to a lot of the other stuff, but their impacts are still profound, and we don't fully understand what they're doing. A lot of them are sometimes doing saprotrophy and turning over decaying matter on the bottom of a pond, but a lot of them are also acting as parasites of other things and modulating the types of ecological interactions that are happening because of the action of these parasites. So aquatic fungi are like this big unknown, but it's starting to sort of resolve, and we're figuring out a lot more as we go. There's not a lot about it in the book, but it was a thing that I've been like really geeking out on. There's fungi associated with animals, and so ruminants like cows, deer, etc. But this is also in reptiles and birds. There's a whole like class of fungi that live in the guts of things and help with digestion, and they like have to live in the guts of things. That's the only place they exist, and it's a relatively recent like evolutionary thing that they do that. But I think that's really cool that there's these like obligate fungal things that live in the guts of animals that help them digest things. We are covered in fungi. All over. All of you have about 10 million yeast living on your scalp right now. I know that sounds a little weird, but it's a good thing because they're there eating the oils that come off your skin. So if they weren't there, you'd be extra oily, and something else worse would probably be there. So they're blocking out something else. A lot of the fungi that are associated with the human body are generally like good. If they're not great, they're at least good. None of them are particularly bad until they decide to be bad. And that's because a lot of them are called dimorphic yeast. They have the ability to become pathogenic by becoming invasive. So they're all kind of like chatting with each other, and they're having a conversation, and they decide, well, I'm going to stop being like a single-celled yeast, and now I'm going to get invasive, and you're going to get all red and itchy, and that's what a yeast infection is. If you have an overgrowth of that yeast on your scalp, that's what dandruff is. If you have an overgrowth of that yeast on your skin, that's what the lightning disease that happened to Michael Jackson was. It's called tinea versicolor, and you get like skin pigmentation loss because of an overgrowth of this fungi. There are, again, fungi associated with animals like cordyceps, and that's a pretty crazy bit of sci-fi. Who here has seen Last of Us? Yeah, I mean, it's really cool sci-fi. It's not necessarily like a realistic situation, but there are fungi who can infect insects. There's a whole bunch of them called entomopathogenic fungi, and those are a really cool thing that people are using in interesting ways. And then there's fungi that are living in rocks. They're called endoliths. And they're things that can live for like 10,000 years, growing extremely slowly, just kind of existing in a rock. And this stuff is like in Antarctica and kind of extreme habitats, but it's really wild to like see what a spread that they can be all around the world. Speaking of, lichens are also all around the world, and those are fungi, although they are the symbiosis of like an algae and a fungi. And so there's just so many different ways that fungi show up in our world that I wasn't fully aware of, and I think when I tell people about this, they're just like, wow, I didn't know that they interacted with all this stuff either, because they co-evolved with everything else on Earth. So they're interacting with the phages, the viruses, the bacteria. Everything in life is touched by and somehow influenced by fungi. And that's really important when we start to think about, well, how does nutrient turnover happen on this planet? So plants are primary producers. They make energy from the sun, and they produce sugars. And then bacteria and fungi break down plant matter and stuff to essentially enable the rest of life to happen. And there's a division of labor there, and the bacteria tend to focus more on nitrogenous compounds like proteins, whereas fungi tend to focus more on complex carbohydrates, i.e. plants, wood, stuff like that, but there is some crosstalk between them. And the action of those two things together is essentially enabling everything else to grow, because they're eating stuff that is not bioavailable. It's locked up somehow, and the enzymes in fungi are to break that down and make it food for everybody again. So they are enabling what's called an ecological succession, as every wave of another thing eats the poop of something else, eats the poop of something else, and eventually we have tuna and humans, which are like the apex predator kind of thing. So it's not an understatement to say that fungi are the keystone of life on this planet, and it really raises the hairs on the back of my neck when I hear the phrase, mushrooms are going to save the world, because I'm like, we are living in a fungi world. Like, this is their world, and we just happen to be in it. And so I think it's important to kind of reframe and think about things a little bit differently, especially as a mushroom hunter, because I have this obsession with going and hunting mushrooms and I want to eat them. But it's important for me also to think about wow, what are the broader roles of these organisms in the world, and how many different ways have I been missing their impacts, and how profound could that be if I understood them better? So that was kind of what I embarked on when I started writing this book. Okay, so what are the forms that fungi take? There we go, there's my cursor. Okay, so plants have kind of, I don't know, hexagonal cells. Plants have a lot of space in between their cells, and that's part of why you can get fungi living in between plant cells. That's what the endophytes are. But plants use cellulose as their structure, and then amylose, which is starch, basically to store energy. And there again, they're autotrophic, so they're making energy from the sun. Fungi and animals diverged a little bit later from plants, so they have been related to each other for longer. But still, they diverged about 1 billion years ago. So plants and animals, or like fungi and animals, are more similar to each other than they are to plants. But there's still been like 8 billion years worth of evolution between them. And so, while they do have some superficial similarities, they are also quite different. So, the things they have in common is some animals, particularly like arthropods and bugs with exoskeletons, use chitin in their exoskeleton for structure, and fungi also use chitin in their cell walls for structure. And then animals use glycogen, which is what we have in our liver, and you need energy to go for a run. You're going to mobilize the glycogen, turn that into glucose in your blood. But the big difference there between fungi versus animals is how they eat and digest. So fungi are what are called osmotrophic, which means they are absorbing their food from the outside. So fungi tend to live in their food, excrete enzymes, and then absorb the stuff inside. Animals have to what's called phagocytose, so they engulf and digest internally as opposed to digesting externally. I would really like to sit in a tub of jelly and just like absorb nutrients. That's not how it works, but I can dream. Okay, so those are sort of like the basic things, like animals eat, fungi sit and digest and then absorb. Those are the big differences. In terms of the forms of fungi, this is not a perfect guide by any means, but this is sort of a brute force scheme that I came up with when I was trying to simplify. There's like so many different kinds of fungi, and I was like, how do I make sense of these in a broader way? So here's 5 categories that most things will fit into. The stuff that's in water is often this kind of aquatic parasitoid or a chytrid. They don't really form mycelium, but they do form these things called rhizoids, which are kind of like weird filamentous growth, and they can like parasitize algae and grow rhizoids into the algae and eat the algae. There's some chytrids that basically their spores turn into harpoons, so they go harpoon an algae, grow more inside of it, burst the algae open, and then go harpoon more algae. It's cool. So there's chytrids that can go hunting, and that's wild. But they're usually single-celled. And then you have molds, which are multicellular filamentous fungi, but do not form mushrooms. You have yeasts, which are single-celled and not filamentous. You have the charismatic macrofungi, which are mushrooms, which is probably why we're all here. And then you have lichens, which is also macrofungi, but is that symbiosis of both fungi and like an algae or a bacterial partner. And the crazy thing that I didn't fully realize is there's things that can be both of like multiple forms, right? So there's things that are both a mold and a mushroom, there's things that are both a yeast and a mushroom, there's things that are like a mushroom and a lichen, and it's depending on what phase of their life cycle that they're in. I was talking about this at dinner before, but if anyone knows the witch's butter, little orange jelly fungi, in one phase, in its sexual phase, it's a mushroom, the orange jelly thing, and then in its sort of clonal asexual stage, it's a yeast. And that yeast can actually be like a human pathogen. And you can look it up in like medical mycology textbooks. And I just think that's really wild that like witch's butter, which is this totally benign little jelly orange thing, lives a whole different lifestyle as this like single-celled yeast and can like even be pathogenic in humans, and that was mind-blowing to me. So, what are mushrooms composed of? And here's think of a mushroom. Mushroom is going to be made out of the same stuff that makes mycelium. It's these hair-like threads called hyphae. In a mushroom, they get all like felted and knotted together to make kind of a more like distinct structure, whereas in the soil they tend to be a little more dispersed. But the single unit of a fungal cell is called a hyphae. They are, depending on which form you're in, yeast are usually sort of a round cell, but a lot of other ones are kind of filamentous, long cells. And if we zoom in on a hyphae and the cell wall, there's 2 really important structures I just bring your attention to. One is the cell wall, which has a scaffolding of different like beta-glucans, polysaccharides, manoproteins, things that make it very strong and allow like lichen hyphae to grow into rocks and literally break rocks off and create soils. It's very adaptable. The cell membrane is a fluid lipid bilayer, kind of like we as human and animal cells have, but that is where fungi are then able to moderate what goes in and out of the cell, and has a lot of ability to kind of communicate with and understand the world around them. So both the cell wall and the cell membrane are very highly adaptable, and that's part of what allows fungi to live so many different lifestyles in so many different places. So this is a very simple scheme that underlies great complexity. So this is sort of a historical classification of fungi. Some of these things have changed a little bit, but this is still basically a really good framework to understand fungi. You have pistonauts, which are a sister lineage of fungi that have chitin in their cell walls. They have cellulose in some of their cell walls, and they eat food. So they're not considered true fungi because they don't match what we consider true fungi. The true stuff is what's the ABCZ. So that is the chytrids, which are those aquatic parasitoids. That's kind of the original form of fungi. Then they moved to land, and you got zygomycetes fungi, which are like the filamentous molds that don't produce mushrooms. And then arose Kingdom Dicaria, which is what contains ascos and basidios. Those are the mushroom-forming fungi. Those are the ones we tend to care more about. Ascos are defined by their, where's my cursor? Anyway, ascos are defined by their these kind of long asci. It's like a balloon full of spores, basically, and that's what would line like the inside of a cup or like the little like hollow inside of a morel. You'd have lots of those things, and they tend to be pressure sensitive. So if you blow on them, they eject their spores into the air and shoot them out there. Basidios have a different spore dispersal structure called a basidium, which is kind of like a club-shaped fist, and all the spores are on there like that. And then those are flung off by basically kind of a water catapult mechanism called a Buehler's drop, which just like flings the spores in the air off the gills. But basically, ascos and basidios are everything we care about in terms of mushrooms. It also makes up the majority of what we know diversity-wise in the fungal kingdom. And there's something like maybe like 93,000 ascos, maybe about 50,000 basidios, and then far less of the zygomycetes and chytrid stuff. But that's kind of the dark matter of those several million fungi that we haven't classified. There's probably a lot more in those other categories that we just haven't necessarily keyed into because they're in aquatic habitats and other places. So these four categories are now represented by like something like 20 different phyla because scientists have been busy at work being nerds and splitting all these things apart. And it's not really important for you to understand as a mushroom hunter because all you really care about are ascos and basidios. And I really like this fungal tree of life diagram. This is from Laszlo Nagy. He's a faculty member in, I don't remember which country, somewhere in Eastern Europe. But him and his student put together this phenomenal diagram. And on the bottom side here is where some of those little like chytrid swimmy things are. There's some kind of early zygomycetes stuff, and like here's one attacking a fruit fly. And then it splits off on the left side here into Basidiomycota. So here's a chanterelle and a witch's butter. Brumaria, like the coral fungi. Here's a Amity muscaria, the fly agaric, a porcini. Here's all the sort of like recognizable mushrooms we see in Basidiomycota. And then Ascomycota is where a lot of the weird stuff is. So you have morels and truffles and cordyceps, but a lot of lichens. Much of the yeast we associate with like human food production, like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is an asco as well. But the ascos are generally like harder to recognize as mushrooms, and so there's a lot more of them, but far fewer of them actually form kind of discernible mushrooms. Whereas about half of Basidiomycota makes mushrooms that we would recognize and agree on as being mushrooms. So there's just a little overview of all the kind of taxonomy and the big picture stuff. Okay, so what are all the ways that fungi live and eat? So there's things called symbiotrophs, and all of this, by the way, is symbiosis. In classical like biology, white male biologists got together and said everything is in conflict and constantly fighting with each other. And it took a woman in about like the end of the 1960s to come along and say, she's studying lichen, and she said, well, I'm looking at this lichen stuff, and it doesn't look like they're in competition. It kind of looks like they're working together. So she proposed a new term called symbiosis, which means things living together instead of just constantly fighting. Of course, everyone pandered and disagreed, but she was ultimately validated, and she was right. Things living in conjunction with each other tends to be a version of symbiosis. Shoot!
What was that scientist's name?
I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I can look it up for you. If you look up like the 1970s lichen female biologist, that'll be her name. I really should know that. Sorry. So there are different flavors of this symbiosis, right? Some of it is mutualism, where things are kind of giving to each other, and we talked about a few examples of that. So mycorrhizal fungi is generally a positive relationship for both parties. The lichenized fungi, the ones that are associated with those algae, are living in something where they're both benefiting from this partnership. And those animal digestive fungi I mentioned are also benefiting from this partnership, where both parties are like, hey, I'm digging this, this is good, let's keep doing it. Then you have the original method of life for fungi, which was to be parasitic. And it's funny because parasitic relationships over a long period of time tend towards being less parasitic. Because if you live in your food and you're eating where you live, it doesn't really behoove you to kill the thing you're living on because you've just ruined your home. So a lot of pathogenic and parasitic relationships over time actually evolved into positive mutualistic relationships. And that's the history of mycorrhizal fungi, is that they were originally parasites that over like a long period of evolutionary time essentially had an arms race to the point they were like, let's just get along instead of fighting because this is like more mutually beneficial for both of us. However, there's still a lot of pathogenic fungi because that is the original way of doing business. So there are things called biotrophs where the host lives. Example of that would be rusts and smuts. Anyone ever seen like orange stuff on the leaves of your roses in the spring? Those are rusts. Those are like the asexual spores of rust. And rusts are crazy because they jump from like plant to plant. A lot of the spores in the atmosphere that go from continent to continent tend to be rusts that are like jumping plant hosts and going through this like multi-year life cycle, which is nuts. Anyone ever heard of Mycological, corn smut? Yeah, it's not like erotica about corn. It's a food. It's corn truffle. If you've been to Telluride, Chad Hyatt cooks it every year and serves it to people. But smuts are another form of like plant pathogen. These things don't kill the plant. They just reduce its productive capacity by impacting its ability to photosynthesize and form fruits. So in agriculture, rusts and smuts are a really big deal. They don't kill stuff, but they're not great for the plants, at least for us humans. There's another example of this called beetle hangers. And I didn't put a photo of this in the book, so that's why I put it in the presentation, because I love it. These are basically like fungal STDs for beetles. And every time beetles get together and do the nasty, they can end up with these kind of like weird fungal genital warts on their faces. And I just think that's weird. And there's people out there who spend their entire lives studying these things. I'm like, there's people who study this as a living, and I'm like, that's awesome. I think it's so cool. And it's so weird, but it's just wonderful. Okay, so there's also necrotrophs, and that's when the host dies. So an example of that would be like a cordyceps, an entomopathogen. Usually the fungi infects the insect and completely takes it over the body of the insect. The insect dies. It's not alive anymore. It might still be moving around, but it's not alive. The fungus is what's moving around. Another example of this would be the tree killers. There's a lot of fungi that just murder trees. Classic example would be like the Cryphonectria, which killed all the American chestnut. And there's stuff like armillaria or honey mushrooms, which just murder trees and they create meadows because they're just mowing down trees. Using this kind of weaponized mycelium called rhizomorphs to like sneak through the soil, sneak up in between the living tissue of the tree and the dead tissue and just girdle the tree, and then they eat the tree. Which is a great example because it brings us over to the next mode of metabolism, which is saprotrophy, or decaying fungi. So honey mushrooms are one of those things that can kill something and then eat it. And there's a lot of examples of things that can kind of switch these ecological modes depending on what fits them and what they wanted to do, because fungi are ultimately very opportunistic. They're not out to do what we want them to do, they're out to do what they want to do, because that's what they've evolved to do. So there's a couple different flavors of saprotrophy. There's white rot, which is more common on hardwoods in like cooler environments, and it leaves this kind of shredded texture. Examples of white rots would be stuff that you guys know, like oyster mushrooms, wine caps, lion's mane. Those are all white rot. They tend to have a little more complex enzymatic functions, and they're a little bit more used in biotechnology because they have these cool enzymes that can break down lignin, which is this like really complex molecule that gives wood its structure. And that's why it leaves it very shredded. And then there's brown rots, which don't eat the lignin and instead are focused on like hemicellulose. And those are a little bit more common on conifers. And so a classic example of that would be like the red-belted conch, the Fomitopsis that you'll see all over the place on like decaying pine trees or spruce or something like that. Then you have composters, which is something that's been more broken down. So example of that is the Agaricus bisporus, the portobello, cremini mushroom that we all eat. That's generally growing on pretty well digested substrate. Then you have stuff like soft rot, which is not common to mushroom hunters, but if you're a homeowner and you've dealt with soft rot, if you live somewhere humid, soft rot gets into the lumber of your house and just starts like destroying it, and that's bad news. And another example is anaerobic fermentation, i.e. the transformation of sugar into alcohols. That's another form of saprotrophy, breaking stuff down to do fermentation and make energy. But I think this is a really cool idea because there's things that kind of shift their form and function and their ecological mode because they're opportunistic. So I mentioned this yeast that lives in our skin, that's this Malassezia. And it's, when it's living on our skin, it can be good, but as I mentioned, you can get an overgrowth of it and it cause dandruff. Same thing with Candida, which is a yeast that lives at all of our orifices, and it's good, you want it there. It's kind of like having a bouncer at the club. You want the bouncer out front, but if the bouncer comes inside and starts a fight, get him back outside, right? And that's sort of what happens is things get thrown off in our microbiome or your hormones or your cycle or whatever happens, and the yeast are chatting with each other and saying, oh man, the defenses are down, let's go inside and start a fight. And you're like, no, stay outside. But they come in, they become filamentous, and that's when you get the red itchy thing. So that's examples of things can be both good and bad, fungi doing that. Another one I think is really cool is Xylaria. This is one of Danny Newman's photos, and I love this Xylaria because most of them do not have a red vegetation, but this one looks really neat. So Xylaria is a large family. Xylariaceae is a bunch of stuff that are called carbon fungi. So these are ascos that are living inside of plants as endophytes. I'm using some of these sort of fancy words to try to familiar you guys with them. And again, there's no test, just stick with me. So the asco endophyte is living inside of the tree, helping the tree kind of do its thing, and it's relatively benign. It's not like helping or hurting necessarily, but it's there inside the tree. And then once the tree dies, it undergoes a mating cycle and forms mushrooms. And the reason they do this whole life cycle is because they're the first on the scene to eat all the sugars. And so those Xylaria and carbon fungi are often the first wave of decomposition on any piece of dead wood, and then later on other types of fungi will move in there. But this entire section of fungi, their whole lifestyle is just hang out and wait until the thing dies and then mate. And there's a lot of things you see that do that same kind of life cycle. If you've ever visited a burn and there's all those little orange cups and purple cups, those have a similar thing, and they're sort of hiding out inside of plants, just waiting for this disturbance to come, and then they undergo like a sexual reproduction life cycle and go back to hiding in plain sight. And this is why it's so easy to miss fungi, because they're all around us all the time, but they haven't got quite the right conditions to form sort of the macrofungi where we know that they're there. So I think that's all pretty neat. Okay, we're going to talk about mycorrhizal relationships because I think everyone has pretty good feelings about mycorrhizal relationships. If I say this word, you're like, yeah, right? Everything's sharing nutrients into the ground. There's this amazing wood-wipe network where things are all altruistically giving to each other. It's a really nice metaphor for maybe how we should all be. The unfortunate part is it's not real. There's a lot of shades of understanding mycorrhizal relationships, and a really important one is to just understand the basic types. And this is the thing that a lot of people don't really get. About 80 to 90% of plants on the Earth's surface are associated with mycorrhizae, but it's arbuscular mycorrhizae, which are zygomycetes, filamentous fungi that do not form mushrooms. So these still go into the roots of plants, and they form a little structure inside of the plant cell called an arbuscule, where it does the nutrient-water exchange with its host plant, but it's not forming mushrooms, and it's got sort of a short network. So these things are still really important, especially in agriculture and grasslands and a lot of places where we don't have heavy forests. Fungi are the predominant type of mycorrhizal relationship, but they're not forming mushrooms, like I said. So the type that does form mushrooms are called ectomycorrhizal, and those are different because instead of actually going inside the plant cell, they kind of wrap the root in a sheath. But those are only associated about 1% to 2% of all plant species. However, they're associated mainly with trees. So they're really impactful and profound because a lot of the carbon that gets fixed on this planet is fixed by the ectomycorrhizae. So there's something like 13 million gigatons of carbon per year gets fixed by ectomycorrhizal, even though there's so much more arbuscular. They only fix about 9 gigatons of carbon per year. So that's because the ectomycorrhizal fungi are able to grow longer networks, and they're what we think of as mycorrhizae, but understanding this sort of key difference is really important because there's different associations for these fungi. In a lot of situations, and particularly this is somewhat dependent on where you are in the world, there's more diversity of the ECM fungi in the giant boreal forests in Siberia kind of thing, and there tends to be more AM fungi in human environments, in gardens. What's growing in your garden isn't the mycorrhizal fungi that you think of hunting porcini, unless some of you guys in Colorado probably have wonderful yards with lots of wild trees. But for the most part, your garden bed probably has arbuscular mycorrhizae, which are really good for healthy soils and plants. But they're that's why you're not getting mycorrhizal mushrooms. You're not getting chanterelles in your garden bed. You might find a little saprotrophic thing, but not mycorrhizal stuff. So it's important to kind of understand those two differences. There's another one called ericoid mycorrhizae, which is much less common, and it's associated with Ericaceae, so blueberries and cranberry stuff in high altitude bogs. And these things are sort of spaced out like where they are in the world, depending on like the altitude and where they are in this kind of equatorial thing. Is like there's more of the AM fungi in tropical areas, but that's not always consistently true, because I've been to Mexico and I've talked to people who go to like Peru and Ecuador, and if you go way up in elevation, you see a lot more mycorrhizal species. So sort of at lower elevations, you're going to have more of the AM fungi, and then in more sort of like forested areas, you're going to have more of these ECM diversity. And I'm just trying to like help you guys be familiar with this idea, because we talk about mycorrhizal relationships as if they were all the same, and they're not. And they even like, the AM fungi are really good at fixing phosphorus in a way that like the ECM aren't. So there's different specialties, and different plants will often mix and match the different types of mycorrhizae based on their needs. And that brings me to this idea of the mycelium economic marketplace. And this is a different mode than what you've probably seen. Who ever seen Fantastic Fungi? Or even like Avatar? You know the scene where there's the tree and there's all like the blue roots in the ground, and you're like, yeah, look at the mycelial network go, yeah! It's not like that. It might be in a forest where everything is genetic related. And that's where the work for the Wood Wide Web was done. It was done in like a pure culture of like dug fir trees where everything was a genetic clone of each other. So it's not that surprising to think that if everything is related and they're all genetically identical, maybe some of the mycorrhizal stuff is a little bit more sharing from individual to individual. But when you have like a mixed forest with a lot of different tree types, especially like conifer plus deciduous trees, that is not what it looks like. Instead, every tree is an individual, and much like if all of us went to a financial advisor in this room, we would get different advice because of our age, our relative like financial situations, the risk we can tolerate. So they'd set us up with like a different mix of assets for us to invest in. Trees are the same way, and the way I like to help you guys to think about this and visualize this is, imagine you have two pine trees. One is in a valley, and one is on a ridge. The one in the valley has all the water and nutrients it needs in the soil, but it's surrounded by other trees. So it needs to recruit fungi that can help it grow really tall and fast to be competitive. The pine tree that's up on the ridge doesn't have any competition, so it doesn't need to grow quickly, but it just needs to hang on and survive. So it really needs fungi that can dig into the soil and get all of the water and the nutrients possible. So those two trees are the same thing, but are stacking a different set of fungi depending on their own personal needs. On top of that, the fungi are looking at these trees saying, well, what are you going to offer me, bro? Like, this is not a one-way partnership. I want something back, so I need some carbon. I need some energy. And I thought this was a really cool idea. As I sit on the Sonoma Mycology Association. I ran our scholarship program for a couple of years because I wanted to read grant applications and learn about this field. I have a PhD in like wine yeast stuff, but not mushrooms. So I was like, I want to read a bunch of mushroom papers, and this was a really cool way to do it. There was an application that came in from someone who was studying salmon die-offs in the Pacific Northwest. And essentially what they saw is they were looking for like the density of porcini populations in relation to the salmon. And trees that are right on the edge of the stream don't have porcini because the salmon wash up and die, and the trees are able to access all the nitrogen from the salmon. If you want to find the porcini, you go a couple hundred feet back from the water line. That's where all the porcini are, because those trees have porcini that will grow mycelium all the way out to the edge of the water line and suck the nitrogen and bring it back. But those porcini are expensive. They're high risk, high reward. There's other mushrooms that are low risk, low reward. So an example of that would be like the Lactarius and Russula, which are everywhere. Many trees have those because they don't take a whole lot of the carbon. Porcini can take up to like 5-6% of the carbon made by the tree, whereas I don't know what the percentage, but the Lactarius are way less. And that's part of why stuff like Russula and Lactarius are far more common, because it's like carrying penny stocks. There's not a lot of risk in it. And I just thought that was such a cool idea, because as a forager, if you find a tree that has the mushrooms you want, you say, well, what is it about this tree and its particular situation that led it to having these mushrooms? And then how do I replicate that and find more of these trees, right? So I thought this was a really fun idea. I talked to Toby Kears, who is, anyone read Entangled Life by Marilyn Sheldrake? Good book, you should read it. It's a little more lyrical than my book. My book is more of a reference book. But Merlin works for Toby. He does his postdoctoral work with Toby Kears. She's one of the most predominant mycelial researchers in the world. She runs the SPUN network, or the Society for Protection of Underground Networks. And I talked to her about this and was like, hey, I'd like you to contribute something to my book. And so I sent her what I'd written about mycorrhizal networks. And she got back to me and was like, hey, Gordon, this is not critical enough. And I was like, what? I thought I'd written a pretty critical take on the idea that like mycelium is the internet of nature. And she's like, no, not at all. You need to go back in the literature and really read about this. So I went in and did a lot more work, wrote something again and sent it back to her, and she said, okay, I'm actually comfortable commenting on your book, but what I wanted to do was originally just have 2 trees, like the roots meeting underground and the hands shaking, kind of share nutrients. And I was like, no, having talked to Toby, I was like, I have to adopt a new model for understanding this and teaching people, because this is way less, it's way more nuanced, it's way more complex, it's hard to understand. It's not as easy as saying, oh yeah, all the trees are friends underground, like, yay. That's a much easier concept to understand. It's harder to say every tree is an individual and it has its own individual needs, but that's kind of what the idea of this figure was. So don't worry about it. If you want to learn more about the kind of whole like carbon fixing thing, you can check out this mycorrhizal mycelium is a global carbon pool. And then the one that is really like a hardcore scientific pushback on the idea of the Wood Wide Web is the other one, this positive citation bias and overinterpreted results lead to misinformation on common mycorrhizal networks in forests, which is about as much of a smackdown as you can get in science. You don't need to read those because I read them, but you can read the sort of summarized versions in my book if you want. So that is most of the science portion done. Shoot, yes, what's up?
So just to make sure I'm understanding.
Yes.
So like if you go to Aspen,
Yep.
those are all like connected.
Yes, those are clones of, many aspen groves are clones of each other.
So those are clones, so you might find the same type of mushroom or mycelium or whatever there, versus if you go to Black Forest, where we have a mix of trees, those are all the individual trees.
Yep.
And you're going to get a mix of different things.
Yes.
There.
I mean, there's also the challenge of this, and in that paper I just mentioned, their whole thing was saying, well, we can't really say there's this contiguous underground, there's the idea of this common mycorrhizal network, sort of like the Wood Wide Web, but we don't know, we can't map it. This is like hair-like stuff that's invisible in the soil. When we dig the soil up and try to map it, like, no, you dig it up, you just destroyed the network. So that was kind of the point of this scientific paper, was like, we don't have good enough methods yet to actually say that there is this long-reaching mycorrhizal network and there's nutrient sharing. What they showed in the Wood Wide Web study was essentially they gave radio-labeled carbon to one tree and then showed that that radio-labeled carbon showed up in a couple other trees nearby, and then they made this assumption that everything was sharing. The problem is that I think that experiment has been repeated in areas where like there wasn't a mycorrhizal network and the carbon still ended up in other trees simply like by diffusion through the soil. And so it's a big outstanding question. Is like, I do think that in some contexts there is nutrient transfer across the mycelial network. I just don't think it's quite as like hunky-dory, like community vibes underground as we'd like to think it is, even though that's a really nice narrative and it makes you feel good to think about that. So that's kind of the idea. Shoot.
Can you talk about what Toby Cruz is doing in the Spun Network in terms of actually trying to map that?
A little bit. So I mean, the Spun Network, you should check out their website because they'll do a much better job summarizing this stuff. But they are funding scientists and expeditions to go around the world, and in this map has a lot of gray area, right? It's not because there aren't fungi there, it's because we haven't like led expeditions there and analyzed the stuff in the soil. And so part of what the Spun Network is doing is trying to go to some underserved areas, do soil sampling, do sequencing, actually get into the soil and literally trying to map mycelial networks. So they're sort of an organization that's funding this science, and they have a lot of private funding, so they're less dependent on the funding cycles that we're kind of undergoing now. But that is the general idea of what they're doing. And they are having an amazing time like recruiting scientists and researchers to go around the world and do this stuff. And I think it's really important and interesting work. But it's hard enough to try to educate people just on the difference between like AM versus ECM fungi, because most people just think of mycorrhizae as this uniform thing. And that's at least one thing I hope you'll walk away from this talk, is understanding those differences. Okay, so I'm done with science for now. Instead, we're going to talk about foraging and mushrooms and seasonality. So in the spring, I live in California, and that means I can mushroom hunt almost all year long, which is awesome. You guys have kind of a contracted summer season, but it's also a really awesome season. So you guys live in a really great place for mushrooms. I would just go to California in the winter if I were you. That's me. Okay, so in the spring, I can hunt morels, and if I go to a burn, I can find a lot of morels. In the summer, I love going back to Massachusetts where my parents live, and I'll hunt there, and I have a chance to find like black trumpets and chanterelles and cool lactarius and honey mushrooms, all sorts of stuff. In the fall in California, if it rains early enough, we're going to get a nice big flush of porcini. We get Boletus edgeless, var, grand edgeless. You guys get the rubriceps. In the spring, we also get Rex varus up in the mountains, which is pretty cool. In the winter, we have what's called the winter trio. So we get the black trumpets, the hedgehogs, the yellowfeet. We can find old matsutakes, There's more diversity in the fall season, but there's a lot of mushrooms in the winter, and basically if you find mushrooms in the winter, they're usually the edible ones, which is nice. But it's a little less exciting than in the fall where you're just seeing lots and lots of different things. So I like that foraging connects us to the seasons, and because I'm a belly hunter, I'm basically eating mushrooms year round because of this. And if I can't find mushrooms, I'm gonna go travel and find mushrooms there. So, although coming out here, it's now morel season in California, and you guys are still too early. So this is pretty much what happens anytime I travel is I'm like, I'm going somewhere to get mushrooms. They're at home, and they're not where I am going because there's an epic drought, and that's just the way that travel works. Okay, so I don't need to talk about all my best practices, but I think one of the important things to do is if you're foraging, it's really a good idea to have some guidelines and a little bit of like an ethical framework for what you do, because you don't want to have just an extractive relationship with nature. I really don't like when I'm teaching people about mushrooms and someone says, well, what does that mushroom do for me? And I'm like, it's a mushroom. It exists to be a mushroom. It doesn't need to do anything for you. And I know what they mean is, well, can I eat it? Can I make medicine out of it? Can I, put it in, can I make art out of it? And I think it's important to remember that like mushrooms deserve their own right and respect unto just being themselves. And we as humans need to understand that like it's not just us taking, we should also think about how we can give back or what can we do with our practices to kind of like better influence the world we're in. So I'm going to just quickly run through some things. It's always a good idea to be allowed to forage where you're foraging. I don't always adhere to that, but in general, you should probably like have a permit or have permission or at least know that you could be there picking mushrooms. In general, I only like to take the mushrooms that I need or can reasonably use and process. I think there's a temptation to sometimes get greedy if you're in an extremely huge flush, but it's a good idea to say, you know what, I'm gonna like, my basket's full, my arm is tired, I'm just gonna go back to the car and go home and process these mushrooms instead of being like another basket and filling another basket, unless you actually have something to do with all those mushrooms. So the rule of thumb in terms of what comes from the book Braiding Sweetgrass, that has much more on the sort of ethical framework for this kind of stuff, but it's, Robin says, leave the first, leave the last. I'm a little less hardcore about that, but I try to leave about a third of the mushrooms I find, and especially like I harvest the mushrooms I actually want to eat. So leave the really young ones to get bigger and leave the really old ones to just kind of sog out and take the prime ones that you actually want. And share some, right? Don't just keep them all to yourself. Like give them to friends and family, share the wealth a little bit. And I think that's a really good way to like spread the joy of foraging as well as sort of the knowledge of like you can tell your friends and family like, hey, I got these from the local forest. Maybe we should all go to a town hall meeting and protect the local forest because we're getting food from there, right? So it's a good way you can engage people in that conversation about conservation. In general, I like to pick mushrooms and carry them in a breathable container. So I have these kind of like wicker baskets. Some people use mesh bags, whatever you want, but like, it's good to like kind of spread the spores around. That could be your role as part of stewardship in nature, is if you're picking a mushroom you really like, well, why not break up a couple little pieces and spread them around, right? Does it do anything? I don't know, but it certainly doesn't hurt. It's a good idea to recognize invasive plant species and pull them out. If you know they're invasive, don't pull out native plants, but if they're invasive plants, you're like, you shouldn't be here, yank it out. Even better if it happens to be an edible one, and you can take it home and eat it, do something with it. It's always a good idea to kind of clean and sanitize your boots, especially going from like habitat to habitat. Just dip in a little bit of water with 10 bit bleach. That's never a bad thing to do. When possible, sand your trails, establish paths, try not to compact the forest floor, and if you're going to go off path, just don't trample young plants. That's pretty standard stuff. And I also really like to just carry like an extra bag to pick up plastic, glass, metal, trash, anything like that. I don't love it when people leave like orange peels in the woods, but those will eventually biodegrade. It's the stuff that doesn't biodegrade that I try to pick up and bring with me. And it's nice to have like another bag to do that because you don't necessarily want to put this like gross can of old beer in with your like nice mushrooms kind of thing. And I think the last thing I said is sort of like lead by example. If you're gonna preach this stuff, try to actually do it. And that's one of the things I've kind of taken upon myself. I'm challenging myself to like live up to the standards that I'm setting for myself. And these are just my frameworks. You can do whatever you want, but have some sort of framework that you function with. And I think that's kind of what I'm encouraging people to do is find what works for you and stick with it and then teach people about it. So, what are some common mushroom myths and some things you hear a lot and how do we debunk them? Because the only true rule about mushrooms that I can tell you that is universally true is that there's an exception to every single rule, right? So, these are some of the most common sayings I've heard, and I know there's lots of other out there, but like, it's kind of the idea that like people are like, well, I don't really want to learn mushrooms. Can I just have like a leaves of 3, let it be kind of thing? Isn't there some easy hack that I just know it's toxic versus edible? And you're like, no. That doesn't exist for mushrooms. You gotta learn mushrooms more like one by one. In fact, usually what I recommend people do is treat mushrooms as if you were playing a role-playing game. You're starting as a level 1 wizard, and all you know how to do is cast fireball. You only know how to like go pick chanterelles. Someone taught you that, I'm gonna find chanterelles. So you go out as a level 1 wizard, and you spam fireball at all the rats and zombies and whatever else until you level up, and now you've learned a new spell. Now you can identify ruby porcini, so now you know lightning bolt as well as fireball. And as you go out and as you see more mushrooms, as you level up, eventually you're a level 99 wizard like David Aurora, and you can eat everything, although you may not want to go quite that far into it. Okay, so what are some of the common mushroom myths? Avoid eating mushrooms with gills. Well, that's silly because there's a lot of great edible gilled mushrooms. I think that's one that very beginners have an easier time identifying stuff like boletes and polypores, and I would recommend that if you're getting started. The edible mushrooms in my book are graded kind of by difficulty, and boletes and polypores are easy compared to a lot of gilled stuff, which is a little more complicated because there's more nuance. White-gilled mushrooms are deadly poisonous. Well, that's meant to help you avoid deadly amanitas, but then you'd be missing out on matsutake, which is a really great edible mushroom that you guys do get these. There you are, matsutake. Mushrooms that grow in grass are safe to eat. Well, there's plenty that grow in grass that are safe to eat, but the most common mushroom that grows in grass in summer in North America is called the vomiter. That's what happens if you eat that. So it's chlorophyllum molybdes. It makes you vomit. I've also talked to some people who say they cook it and they eat it and they love it, so I'm like, I don't totally... There's always those things within the mushroom community where someone says one thing and you're like, I've been telling people this is toxic and you're telling me you're eating it. I'm not going to go around and tell people to eat this, but I might try it someday just to see what happens. Granted, I might vomit, so who knows. Boletes that stain blue are poisonous. This is one you hear a lot, especially from like European mushroom hunters. And I think the misunderstanding is in Europe there are actually a couple of blue staining boletes that are toxic. We in North America really only have the rubro boletus, at least on the west coast, and then sometimes the east coast you see this thing called Boletus huronensis, which just stains slightly blue. But outside of that, there's a bunch of other boletes that stain blue, and they're all edible. And some of them are pretty good, like butter boletes, I really love. But having just told you that rubro boletus, the Satan's bolete, is toxic, there's a thing that says do not eat boletes with red pores, especially if they stain blue. And that's meant to help you avoid eating the Satan's bolete. However, there is frost bolete, this crazy red one that I see on the East Coast. That's a red pored bolete that stains blue. It tastes like lemon. It's delightful. And then there's the liver bolete, and the Suellus amygdanalis, and this is another like red pored bolete that stains blue. And you can cook it really well, and it's perfectly edible. It's kind of musty, and I don't love it, but like it's not toxic. So there's just exceptions to all of these rules, and many of these rules are really just trying to get you to avoid one particular type of mushroom, which is why it makes more sense to like learn the mushrooms individually than have some sort of blanket rule that confuses you and might make you fearful of other mushrooms. Here's a good one. If animals are eating a mushroom, then it's safe for you to eat. Okay, here's a question. Would you let a squirrel drive your car? No. So why would you go and trust a squirrel to like tell you that you can eat this mushroom, right? I'm constantly like flabbergasted by this because I'm like, that squirrel could go and eat a death cap and then run off and die somewhere else, and you would have no idea. You just were like, yeah, that squirrel knows what he's doing. No. So, just don't trust the animals eating something. Just learn the mushroom and go through the books and the guides and, do all of the stuff you need to identify it. Don't just say, well, that was being eaten by an animal, it's safe, But there's a surprising number of people who think stuff like that. There's also people who are like, yeah, if you put it in like a piece of copper and it turns blue, then it's safe to eat. You're like, also, that is not true. These are things that might be true for like one particular type of mushroom, but it's not a general rule. And these things get repeated as if they're general rules when there's actually like a very specific set of circumstances where it is true. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get you guys to think about is question all these rules because there's always an exception. If it's small and brown, throw it down. That's generally a pretty good piece of advice, especially if you're trying to hunt psilocybe mushrooms. But then you'd miss out on stuff like candy caps, which you don't get out here, but we get out west, and they're beautiful mushrooms that smell like maple when you dry them out. And there's also Marasmius aurates, which is like a meadow mushroom that tastes really good. And the last one is all polypores that grow in wood are safe to eat. And most polypores that grow in wood are safe to eat, but let me introduce you to the nesting polypore, Haplopilis, which makes a beautiful purple color, but it also causes like massive brain damage if you eat it. So not everything that grows on wood is safe to eat. And this is, again, just trying to show you guys there's always an exception. So, does cut versus picking affect mushrooms? And this is probably the most common argument I have online. And with like 3 million people seeing my content, I get an unbelievable number of death threats over this particular issue. Because if you've seen it, I do a lot of videos where I kind of like tap a mushroom and then pick it. And I do that, I cut mushrooms sometimes, but I tap and pick because people like the noise it makes. It's ASMR content, it causes tingles in the back of their brain. It doesn't do anything for me, but for me it's pretty easy. I'm like, all right, I'll whack it and pick it, you know? And then I stitch together a big, like, compilation of those, and then it gets like millions upon millions of views. I'm like, all right, that's fine, I can make this content. But then I get death threats from people and be like, you don't know how to harvest mushrooms. Or someone's like, I've been studying mycology for 40 years. Learn how to pick a mushroom from the, like, without using the roots. And I'm like, if you've been studying mycology for 40 years, you should know mushrooms don't have roots. But okay, so the only piece of science that's really been done about this is there was a 2006 publication from about a 30-year study that was done in Switzerland. And there was another follow-up study that was done for about 14 years in Netherlands with the same, and Norway with the same design. And they had plots, many plots, of cut versus pick versus no pick. And they went every year and they measured the diversity of fungi, the size of the mushrooms, and the number of the mushrooms. And this data, this is sort of a simplified version of it as opposed to what's in the paper. But basically, from year to year, there was differences because every year there was a different amount of rain or the conditions were different. So yes, from year to year, there's definitely significant differences. But between these three treatments, there was never a significant difference between the treatments. So to me, as a scientist that says, it doesn't really matter if you pick or you cut. The only thing they really concluded from this entire study was that the areas where there was less, or where they were not picking at all, actually had fewer mushrooms overall than where they were picking. So that sort of said, well, maybe human mushroom picking has some sort of positive influence on helping more mushrooms show up, which doesn't surprise me if you're doing stewardship and you're helping to kind of spread the spores around. A lot of mushrooms are limited by how far their spores can go. And the role of animals in ecosystems is often to find mushrooms, eat mushrooms, and move the spores around. So if we are, recapitulating the role of an animal, we could be helping. We have a role to play as stewards. The other thing they saw from the study that I thought was significant was in areas where they had some things that had paths and then other places that didn't have paths. And where they had no paths, they observed more compaction of the soil and fewer fruiting bodies. And I thought that was really important because there's places in California that are amazing mushroom habitat, but so many people go there that the forest floor just looks like it's been walked over by like thousands of people. And there's still plenty of mushrooms there, but I'm like, how many more mushrooms would there be if we weren't tromping all over this? And that's an issue because in California, they've made only like 3 state parks that you go foraging at legally, and so everyone goes to those 3 places. If they were to open it up to everybody and charge like a license fee, that wouldn't be a problem. But it's the legislation that's in place that's causing this problem. So, and I will say, there's nuance to this idea of cut versus picking, because something like a chick in the woods polypore, if it's growing out of a tree, I might not want to rip the whole thing out of the tree if this thing's going to grow for several weeks. So I'll take a knife and I'll cut off like the tender edge of the growing polypore and leave some behind. And that's the same sort of idea. If you find like a cluster of mushrooms, you're like, well, I don't want to uproot the whole cluster. I will use a knife just to cut a few off. That's fine. There's also a theory that if you cut a mushroom, the base that's left over may be at risk for infection by pathogens and might ultimately end up hurting the mycelium by having molds and other stuff get into it. So again, I don't think it really matters. Figure out your best practices. For me, stuff like chanterelles and porcini, I like to pick them and because there's a lot of edible stem underneath the surface, and then I'll kind of clean that off. There's certain things like saprotrophs, because their mycelium is closer to the surface, I would consider like harvesting them with a knife. But again, in an overall sense, I don't think it really matters, and I don't think you should be like sending death threats to people on the internet over whether you're picking or cutting mushrooms. So, I like to hunt mushrooms and bring them home because I like to cook and eat them. And one of the things I have with mushrooms is that I run into people all the time and say, I don't like mushrooms. And I'm like, well, is it the taste or is it the texture? For some people, it's the taste, and that's an easy fix because I'm like, all right, well, stop eating portobellos, go eat a lion's mane. Go eat a maitake. Go eat a mushroom that tastes totally different. Because portobellos are so intense that a lot of people have just like, I don't like mushrooms categorically, but if you just ate an eggplant and based all of your observations on vegetables on an eggplant, you'd be like, I don't like vegetables. But like, yeah, but try a piece of broccoli. There's so many different kinds of things that if you don't like one mushroom, try a different mushroom. I've found lots of people who are like allergic to one mushroom and they get scared, but if they try other mushrooms, they're not allergic. They can eat lots of kinds. The mushroom that causes the most allergic reactions in the United States is Agaricus bisporus because it's the most widely consumed. You know, so if you had a reaction to that, just try a different mushroom. You might not be allergic to all mushrooms. They're pretty different from each other. And if people don't like the texture, then I talk to them about cooking and the different methods and ways to cook. I think fundamentally, Western society has been misled about how to cook their mushrooms because we got our advice from French Julia Child, kind of like culinary history, that said lots of oil and butter in the pan and don't crowd the pan with your mushrooms. And I think that is terrible advice because you end up with these really like oily mushrooms, and if you do crowd the pan at all, they end up like steamed and kind of like insipid and floppy, and you're just like, I don't really like this that much. What you want is a nice, meaty, somewhat chewy mushroom, and the way you get that is by doing what's called a dry saute, or in some cases, a wet saute. And this is basically, mushrooms are a sponge, culinary sponge, and you gotta squeeze all the water out first. If you add oil before you squeeze the water out, the oil keeps a lot of that water in the mushroom, and that's why they're floppy and they don't taste good. Because you're like, I don't like that slippery texture. I want something that's kind of meaty and chewy instead of slippery and bleh. So the way to do that is just take all your mushrooms, and I like to wash my mushrooms. I have no problem getting them completely wet because I'm gonna crowd the hell out of the pan, put them all in, no oil or butter, and cook all that water out. So I put a little bit of salt on, cook the water out. Once the water is pretty much gone dry and the mushrooms are just barely starting to stick to the pan, you add a little neutral oil, a little more salt, you fry medium-low heat for another like 10-15 minutes. Then at the very end, that's when you put a nice big knob of butter and garlic and wine and kind of finish them off, pick them up in that final way. And even then you could put them into like another pasta dish or something like that. But that simple change in the order of operations of how you cook mushrooms will significantly impact the flavor and the texture of the mushrooms you're cooking. This is really important for stuff like chanterelles too, because I cooked for chanterelles for years. I thought they were terrible. I was like, what's the big deal? Why do people like these mushrooms? They're so floppy. And then I started doing the dry saute and I was like, oh, now I like them. So, shoot. Yes, yeah. So that's, I have a whole thing in the book on washing mushrooms. And what she's getting is a lot of people say, no, just wipe them with a towel. And I'm like, sure, if you find the most perfect porcini that really doesn't have dirt on it, yeah, you can use a little bit of a wet towel to wipe off any bit of errant dirt on the cap and just eat it. And I've eaten porcinis like straight out of the woods that we put in butter and cooked. Amazing. However, a lot of times you get mushrooms that are just completely covered in dirt. In California, our national state mushroom is Cantharellus californicus, and they call them mud puppies. They are just living in the dirt, and they never come out clean. They're always nasty. So if I eat that, it's gonna taste like dirt. If you wash the dirt off, it tastes less like dirt. It still tastes a little like dirt. So I like to wash my mushrooms, and some people are like, well, you're gonna get them wet, and their idea is that it has to be dry when it goes into the butter, otherwise it won't brown. I'm like, I don't care, because I'm gonna do that wet saute thing, or the dry saute with no oil or butter, so I don't care how wet it is to start. If you really want mushrooms to be dry after you wash them, say for something like a morel and you want to like fry it in butter and not have it splatter all over the place, put it in a salad spinner and just wick the water off. So there's ways to get around it, but I think it's a really silly notion that we shouldn't get mushrooms wet. And again, there's nuance there, because something like a porcini, I usually put those under running water and use a veggie brush to kind of scrub them clean, but I don't soak them. Something like a black trumpet or morel, which is much more textural and has lots of little holes where sand and bugs and stuff can get stuck in there, I soak those, and I'll soak them multiple times until the water runs clear, and then I go ahead and cook them. So it depends on the type of mushroom and the kind of cleaning you need to do. Is it really dirty, or is it just a little bit dirty? If it's a little bit dirty, sure, you can wipe it off, but if you have a mud puppy like I do in California, I'm not eating dirt, so I'm gonna wash it. That's my personal preference. And beyond just doing that sort of dry saute thing, there's a whole bunch of different ways to cook mushrooms. And that's part of why I put this infographic in here, because I was just trying to think like, what are all the different ways I've seen mushrooms cooked and prepared? And what's really cool is if you start to think about mushrooms a little bit more like meat, you're like, well, would you ever just like put plain chicken in a pan? Like, no, you normally like season it. You marinate it. But how often do you just put plain mushrooms in a pan? Almost always. So why not like do a little bit more work? Do like a pre-marination step on your mushrooms. Maybe consider like baking and roasting them first and then throwing them into a dish. Like do multiple cooking steps. You can even like smoke them to add this like really cool smoky flavor, partially dehydrate them, change the texture, then throw them into a stir fry and bring this extra element that you didn't have before. And so I think this is a really fun idea when you start thinking about cooking mushrooms, is put the effort you put into meat into cooking mushrooms, and you're gonna end up with a much more interesting product. When it comes to preservation, I typically dry a lot of my mushrooms. There's certain mushrooms that you improve the flavor through drying, stuff like morels, porcini, shiitake. You get a much more intense umami character when you dry the mushroom. But there's certain things that don't dry super well, and you kind of lose the texture, and the flavors doesn't really improve. So something like chanterelles, I don't think dried chanterelles are great. I've rehydrated them, and I'm kind of like, the texture's gone, and I don't love the flavor. So what I like to do is I cook and I freeze them. And my favorite thing to do is try to cook them sort of like as minimally as you can. I do that dry saute, cook the water out. But if you load them up with oil and butter and then freeze them, oil and butter is really what absorbs that rancid freezer flavor. So if you're basically able to either boil your mushrooms or cook them most minimally in a tiny bit of oil and salt and then freeze them, they will last quite a long time. And I've eaten mushrooms that are easily like 2 years old and they don't get freezer burned in the way that a lot of other stuff does. They do eventually get freezer burned, but you can also throw in a bunch of chorizo and who cares? It tastes fine. Beyond drying and freezing though, there's a lot of other methods. There's pickling, which you guys understand. There's conserva, which is sort of like a quick pickle. You basically boil mushrooms in kind of vinegar and then top them with oil and keep them in the fridge. That's great in salads and pizza and stuff like that. You can, I really like playing with candies and syrups with mushrooms. This fall I was making I candy the chanterelles in a little bit of a caramel, and then I put them with apple pie filling, and then put them in hand pies and turnovers and stuff, and that was really phenomenal. I've done a lot of different versions of kind of sweet mushroom dishes, which is not where your head first goes, but they can integrate really well as kind of a novel element in a dessert, which is really fun. They also preserve well in sugar, which is another cool thing, because sugar has the capacity to preserve as well as vinegar and salt does. And you can do liquid infusion. So I have candy cat mushrooms. I put them into my, dry them out, put them in my whiskey. I've had truffle vodka, which is really killer. You can put chanterelles in vodka. There's lots of different things you can kind of play around with, and it's fun to start thinking about what are the different ways I can maximize the flavor of a particular mushroom. Particularly one I like to do in liquid is matsutake, because matsutake loses pretty much all of its texture and flavor when you dry it out, but if you chop it up and cover it in sake, then it'll last in the fridge for pretty much a whole year, and you can use that sake while you cook, and you can eat the mushrooms. It's cool. Okay. Also, by the way, this whole flow of the talk is basically following the chapters of my book. So that's if you're like, man, I wanted to see that again, it's in the book. Shoot.
How did the lactic fermentation?
Yeah, lactoferments. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there lactose in some mushrooms?
No. So it's like when you do lacto pickles. So the idea is that there's lactic acid bacteria on the surface of stuff. And when I've done, there's two ways to do lactoferments with mushrooms. You can either do them, you can freeze them and then thaw them and lactoferment those while they're kind of raw, frozen, cryo-blanched. Mm-hmm. But in my experience, those fell apart and got really mushy. The flavor of the brine was good, but I didn't like the mushrooms itself. What I've had more luck doing is blanching the mushrooms, firming up the texture, and then putting them into a brine with a little bit of vegetable, even like a grape leaf or something that has some lactic acid bacteria, and about a 2.5% salt brine. Okay. And then you give it a week at room temperature, and it'll sour itself with the bacteria.
Fermented pickle or
it's not lactose; it's lactic acid that's being formed by the bacteria. So, but it's a zingy kind of acid that's a little different from acetic acid. It's a little less harsh. It's a little softer, so it's not quite as challenging if you don't like vinegar. Okay. We're on to fungal intelligence, and we're actually doing okay time-wise, and we're getting there. There's still a lot of mushroom stuff to get to, so we'll speed up. But fungal intelligence is wild. They're intelligent, but not in the way that we think of animal intelligence. They don't have cognition, they don't have consciousness, and yet they have this incredible ability to coordinate the behavior and sense all sorts of stuff and make what we would see as intelligent decisions. But what do we call that? Because they don't have eyes, they don't have a brain, they don't have individualistic things. They're just this network of little hair-like cells in the ground. But I don't know if you guys have ever tried to get 10 people to go out to dinner and agree on oh, we're all gonna go get pizza. No, I want burgers. Humans are way too individualistic. We have to have our own opinions about everything. In theory, every single little tip of mycelium that's growing is an individual. And yet across a whole mycelial network, they can very quickly make a decision oh, there's food over there, we're going over there. And everybody will draw back and go get the food because they are coordinated. That's what's called network intelligence. They have the capacity to make kind of broad decisions across a population and actually coordinate without fighting over whether they want burgers or pizza. So there's a whole bunch of examples of this, and I talk about this in this chapter 8 in the book. But they can go out and they can forage and search and even have directional memory, like I talked about with those porcini. They can go get the nutrients from the salmon die off. They can sense the environment through lots of chemical cues. There's an idea of what's called the fungal communicome, where fungi are constantly in sort of chemical chatter with each other. And that chemical chatter is part of how like the candida yeast infections happen, because they're like, oh, hey, conditions are good, let's go for it, you know. But they're constantly listening to each other, because communication is not just talking, it's also listening. It's really a good lesson for some people in this room. And they can do long distance communication. They can coordinate, as I talked about. They can do active transport and even like potentially electrical signaling that has some sort of role in their ecology. They can learn, they can adapt, they can anticipate future events, learning from one year to the next year. There's the example of animal manipulation. We talked about cordyceps, where like a fungus can infect an ant, cause it to crawl up a branch, grow a mushroom out of its head. That's what's called the extended phenotype of that fungi. It's exerting its control and influence in the world far beyond the actual body of the fungi. Another great example of this is, who in this room has enjoyed an alcoholic beverage in their lifetime? Yeah, so that was the extended phenotype of yeast. You didn't get drunk, it was the yeast's fault. They can, in a limited capacity, facilitate plant-to-plant interactions. They can touch and recognize self versus other, and it's really wild because there's like, I've seen time lapses of 2 mycelia on like a plate fighting it out, and they're having like a whole like chemical warfare battle between them, so they can like, they know what is them versus others. And that's also where I think it's really interesting when we think about that like contiguous mycorrhizal network. You're like, yeah, sure, things are all growing down to the soil, but they're not all necessarily getting along. There may be some things that are in direct competition with one another and are actually fighting. And then there's even documented things of like fungi that are like, I see you guys fighting, I'm gonna hang back here, and once you guys have both like died out, then I'm gonna come in and eat all your poop. And so there's different strategies that different species have, and that's really profound for how, you know, we think about this kind of complex activity and stuff that's in the soil. And that's really where my mind gets blown. I'm like, oh my God, this is happening all the time, everywhere, and we don't really understand it. And they can also sense light, circadian rhythms, and have a lot of capacity to interact and understand the world around them based on the stuff that's in their cell wall and membrane, and how they can correspond to these things is very much, you know, directed to how they like do internal cell programming to then respond to these external stimuli. So to me, this all says they have a lot of intelligence. Again, it's not like animal cognition, but we have to consider that they are intelligent. There's a surprising role for fungi in the human body. I've mentioned the stuff that's on our skin, the candida that are orifices. Here's a little like diagram of how that, you know, the benign yeast form goes into this sort of filamentous form. That's when we get all like red and puffy and itchy, and that's dependent on a whole bunch of factors that they're sensing as part of that fungal communicome. But there's fungi all over and in the human body, and a lot of it really doesn't show up or have any effect up until our immune systems fall apart. And this is where, if you know someone who's undergoing chemotherapy or has AIDS or is immunocompromised for some reason, this stuff becomes really significant in terms of medical mycology, and these things can be really scary. Human fungal diseases tend to manifest in 3 different ways. The most common is a skin rash. I don't know if anyone here's ever had ringworm. I had some like when I was in New Zealand, and it was like kind of weird and scary, and I kind of ignored it until it like turned to this big red thing on my chest, and I was like, oh my God, I need to like take an antifungal for like 3 months, because fungal diseases tend to take a long time to get established, but also a long time to get rid of. I know a lot of people have had like weird fungus in their toenails for years on end, and then you have to like take antifungals for like 6 months to get rid of it, and they like do liver tests and stuff like that. The other way that fungi can really infect us is through the lungs, and that's like a respiratory infection. Don't go out and take a puffball and go into your mouth. That's a bad idea. That's how you can get a respiratory infection from fungi. And the third, and sort of the most serious but least common, would be like a full like sepsis blood infection, where there's like literally chunks of mycelium moving around in your blood. And that almost never happens unless someone is like already in the hospital and they're being infected by something. So that's not the kind of thing you need to stay awake late at night thinking about, but those are the 3 types of ways that fungi tend to infect the human body. And there's a lot of different fungi in these different tissues. So, and again, they're a very low proportion of the whole like microbiome in our body, but our microbiome has been sort of historically understudied, and people are just now starting to recognize how important, even though there's a very low level of these organisms, because they're profound, because fungi can influence the growth of other things around them, some health conditions might actually be due to an imbalance of our fungal microbiome. And so I think a lot of stuff like psoriasis and eczema and some of those other things might actually be a function of the fact that like your skin microbiome is off, And wouldn't it be cool if there was like a lotion that could fix that because it was not based on something else, based on like almost like a probiotic, but like a pro-fungal lotion you could use that might help solve some of these things. So there's a lot of learning and science to be done. I just think it's kind of neat. Okay, so I've talked about some of the ways that fungi can hurt us. Let's talk about some of the ways that fungi can help us. So my big thing is just trying to get people to eat more mushrooms. I think mushrooms are phenomenal. We should all eat more of them. One of the crazy things is how many mushrooms you can grow on a very small amount of land. You don't need a whole lot of land to grow like 1,000 or 1,000,000 tons of mushrooms there. You don't need a whole lot of power, and you don't need a lot of water. There's a lot of things that are really water intensive. In California, we have tons of almond and beef. That uses a lot of water. Those are pretty protein intensive things, but they use so much water, it would make more sense to take some of those resources and grow more mushrooms if we could convince people to eat more mushrooms. And I get a lot of people asking me like, well, what are the healthiest mushrooms to eat, right? What mushrooms should I be eating that I'm not eating? And I say, well, eat a lot of mushrooms, right? It's best to eat a diversity of stuff. You don't want to just eat white button mushrooms all the time because you're going to get sick of them. And it would make more sense just like you don't just eat eggplant all the time. You eat a mixture of vegetables, so eat a mixture of mushrooms. It makes sense. They're all relatively similar. They do have some nutritional differences, but they're all going to be pretty good for you. The protein that's in mushrooms, although it's significantly less than would be in meat, the protein is actually a really good one-to-one match for what we need because fungi and animals are more closely related. The amino acids in fungi are really good protein for us. The other thing we get from fungi that, like mushrooms in particular, that people don't really consider is fiber. And I guarantee you, everybody in this room needs more fiber. And it's not just about making you poop more. It's about feeding good populations of bacteria in your gut because those fungal sugars get broken down by certain types of bacterial that like digest the linkages. And so you're diversifying your gut microbiome and you're having better like immune response, cognitive function. Just eating mushrooms is really good for your gut and it's good for you. So the last thing, I don't talk a lot about like medicinal mushrooms. I do have a whole section on medicinal mushrooms in the book. I'm not going to talk about this talk because it's its own whole subject. I don't love the way the medicinal mushrooms are marketed because they tend to be very hyperbolic, right? They're always like, oh, we're going to solve your ADHD, we're going to make you sleep better, we're going to do all these amazing things. You're like, well, nothing is a silver bullet for health. Eating mushrooms is really, really good for you, but I can't promise you it's going to like somehow make you like not have the problem you've always dealt with. And I think what's getting lost in that is there is real potential for using medicinal mushrooms in really positive ways, but what we need to recognize is instead of getting caught up in the hype and the marketing around medicinal mushrooms, why not think about all the actual therapies and drugs we've gotten from fungi? Because they are nature's chemists and they've produced a tremendous number of things that have been absolutely transformative and life-changing for the way that like our planet works. So examples would be like penicillin. That's an incredible antibiotic that saved millions of lives. Plaxetil is a chemotherapeutic agent. There's a very famous mushroom personality who is known for telling people that his mother's breast cancer was cured by taking turkey tail. Well, this is the chemotherapeutic agent she was taking, and I think it's really cool because this is actually originally isolated from a fungal endophyte in a Pacific yew tree. So there's like cool biology. We're talking about endophytes now and it producing this chemotherapeutic drug. I'm sure the turkey tail helped as well, but this was the actual drug that probably cured her breast cancer. You know who takes statins? Those are to lower cholesterol and high-density lipoproteins in the blood. That was isolated from Aspergillus, which is the same kind of fungi that's koji makes miso. And if you know anyone who takes cyclosporin, it's an immune suppressant. That is this like crazy complex molecule produced by a cordyceps-like fungus called Tolipocladium, which infects deer truffles, which are like little truffles that live underground. And it uses this complex molecule to repress the immune system of that truffle so it can infect it and grow a mushroom out of it. And we use this molecule to make sure that like your uncle's kidney doesn't get rejected. So I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so what are the ways that we can help fungi? Because we've talked about how they can hurt us, how they can help us. How can we help them? And that's what I was talking about, the kind of like, let's reframe our relationship with them. So there's lots of ways that fungi are being hurt. Very few of them have anything to do with your local forager, right? It's not because some guy picked 2 morels that like there's not morels. It's because, well, maybe like the forest where the morels were growing got mowed down to put in an apartment complex. So the real threats to fungi, as I see them, are much larger than that at the level of the individual. It's stuff like invasive species, plant pathogens, development, urbanization, human land usage, agriculture in particular, degradation, climate change, flooding, pollution. There's all of these things that are like much larger than what we can do. And that's kind of sad because it's really hard to be like, wow, I'm fighting against all this stuff. And the real answer to that is not that all of us have a personal responsibility to do something about this, is that we can put our efforts together, pool them, and try to work, instead of bottom up, we can work top down. So there's an amazing Chilean mycologist named Juliana Furci who started the Fungi Foundation. And the goal of the Fungi Foundation was to essentially be an advocate for the conservation of fungi worldwide. And what they've done is propose this, it's the 3F initiative, and it's flora, fauna, and fungi. So when it comes to conservation legislation, they ask that they are including fungi in the surveys. And this fundamentally changes things. If you get a government to adopt this, now anytime you go to develop land, you have to not just look at the plants and animals, but also the fungi that are there. And if you say happen to have like a piece of forest that you're trying to save, and like the state mushroom grows there, you can make a pretty compelling argument like, hey, maybe don't cut these trees down because our state mushroom grows here, which would be a lot harder to do if you aren't asking them to at least consider the fungi that are there as part of this habitat. So instead of like constantly feeling like we're struggling against the man, we can band together and help support like larger government organizations that can go do some of this advocacy work and make meaningful legislation changes around the world. So that's my pitch for the Fungi Foundation. I'm not going to talk too much about bioremediation, but basically there's an idea that we could use fungi to help us clean up oil spills and stuff like that. It's not as simple as putting like a bag of oyster mycelium on an oil spill. That does not work. What does work is sampling stuff from that site, bringing it to a lab, figuring it out, and then maybe trying to reintroduce that organism to start the waves of biological, ecological succession to help get that back kind of up and running. All of this is basically getting at the idea of a mushroom circular economy. If we integrate fungi and mushrooms into everything we do, we're more sustainable. That's all I'm going to say. But basically, energy, medicine, food, agriculture, everything could be better if we kind of integrated mushrooms at every step and got them kind of on board. So, mushroom cultivation is a thing that you can all do at home. You don't have to, but it's pretty cool, pretty fun. There's some people here in your club who can teach you lots about it. I'm going to skip right through. Mushroom anatomy. I love that Amanita muscaria is the sort of like the poster child for all mushrooms, but it's not great as an actual like mushroom blueprint because it has features that a lot of mushrooms don't have. Most mushrooms don't have warts on top. Many mushrooms are missing a ring or annulus skirt, and a lot of mushrooms, like very few mushrooms, have a vulva, the kind of like weird sac in the bottom. So one of the things I did was present some other like blueprints of what a mushroom looks like. So polypore mushroom, I have a gastroid where the spores are on the inside. Those are other forms of basidio mushrooms. For the ascos, pretty much everything comes down to either a little cup fungi or a flask fungi. So the flask is the cups, I guess you can sort of see what a cup looks like, but a morel is eventually a whole bunch of cups all kind of put together. And then flask fungi is like that little xylaria I talked about. There's lots of little dots on there, and each one of those dots has spores inside. So that's kind of the body plan of different mushrooms that are not just Amanita muscaria. When it comes to identifying mushrooms, this is sort of the most important page of the book. It's page 145. It's the very center of the book. These are 16 morphological archetypes that you can use to kind of have that higher level understanding that when you're out and hunting mushrooms, okay, I have a gilt mushroom, I'm going to be up here in the cap and stem like agaricoids, or maybe I found this like weird coral. Okay, let me go down here and look at like the coral mushrooms and the clubs. And then a lot of books don't give much service to ascos, and they kind of just like don't deal with them. And I didn't want to do that because ascos are really cool and they deserve recognition, especially because they play a much larger role than we actually recognize. So there's a couple categories down here that help you kind of like bin the different types of weird asco mushrooms that you'll find. When it comes to eating mushrooms, edibility is not a yes-no spectrum. It is very much, it is a spectrum, not a yes-no binary. So, you guys have heard the term choice edible before? Yeah, it's a common one. I saw David Aurora talk recently, he's the guy who coined that term, and he said himself, he's like, I don't know why I use the word choice. What a confusing word. And I've talked to so many people when they're getting into mushroom hunting, like, what does choice mean? And well, it means that you would choose to eat it, but I think inherent to that is, I'm like, well, everyone has a different choice. What I did was choose a 5-star system, because I was like, would you rather stay at a 5-star motel or a 1-star motel? I think most of you can probably answer that. So I was like, for foraging, I'd rather stick with sort of like 5 to 3-star, and then leave a majority like the 2 and 1 stars behind. So when someone's on a 4 and they come up to you and say, can I eat this? You go like, well, that's 1 star. You can fuck around and find out, but like, I don't know what you will. And then there's things that like, I don't consider turkey tail, which is medicinal, to be edible. You gotta like process it so you can actually eat it. Because you can sit there and chew on it for hours, but it's not gonna go anywhere. So I think there's shades of nuance to this idea of edible, yes, no. It's like, how about we give it a 5-star system with a couple extra like qualifiers of what I might want from the mushroom. Cultivated mushrooms, edible polypores, boletes, these are like the categories of the edible mushrooms I put in the book. You can also have a spectrum of threat from toxic mushrooms. Some things are deadly toxic, some things are dangerous and they can cause like pretty severe diarrhea and you might go to the hospital if you eat a bunch of them. And then some things, like Amanita muscaria, really aren't that big a deal. This mushroom is both edible, toxic, and trippy all at the same time. If you ate it raw, you would probably have a really bad night, throwing up, having diarrhea. If you double boil it and take all the toxin out of it, you can eat it just fine like a normal mushroom. And if you were to dry it out and turn it into a tea, boil it down with some lemon juice, you would have an entheogen, that is a GABA agonist that makes you feel a lot like booze. So you have a cup of Amanita muscaria tea, and you're like, oh, I'm a little loosey-goosey. And you'll probably sleep well, and maybe have some cool dreams. And then there's like earth balls, these are toxic, but also these are all white inside, you can eat them. And they're the favorite mushroom of people in the Philippines. So what I'm getting at is like a death cap, this mushroom right here is always deadly toxic no matter what you do because it has amatoxins. And then there's other things like this yellow stainer that you eat it, you're going to throw up, but nothing worse is going to happen. So it's important when you're foraging to recognize is this like actually deadly, is it dangerous, or is it just something I should be like aware of? And in the book, I had an idea like, I have a cute little infographic with the toxins and the mushrooms, and it turned out to be like, way more complicated than I thought it would be. So I presented this big table of stuff, trying to teach people about it, and you can read it in the book. But the book goes into a lot more than just edibles. I talk about medicinal mushrooms. I talk about entheogenic mushrooms, which is a polite way to say psychedelics. Urban gastroid mushrooms, so things that are growing in your wood chip beds. I talk about mushrooms that you can dye fabrics with. I talk about colorful mushrooms, which counterintuitively, most colorful mushrooms are not actually toxic. Most toxic mushrooms are pretty boring looking. And then I talk about a bunch of non-mushroom fungi. So here's an up-close picture of the rust, the plant pathogen I mentioned, and a little entomopathogenic fungi attacking a fruit fly. I finish off with fascinating fungal phenomena. My favorite is guttation, and this is mushrooms are growing so quickly they start sweating, basically. This is Hydnellum peckii, and those are not toxic, they're just bitter, but it's growing so fast, it's literally sweating moisture out of it, which I think is cool looking. You have fluorescence, so this is when you shine a UV light on it, it gets excited and shoots light back out, so light in, light out. Lots of things fluoresce, they're just cool, it's a great tool to use for identification. It doesn't really tell you much about the mushroom, it's just neat. Bioluminescence is when the mushroom itself is producing light at a low level. This is a jack-o'-lantern, you can see it, it's one of the few mushrooms you can actually see with the naked eye, glows bright green. You do have to go play 7 Minutes in Heaven in a closet with this thing to actually see it, but it does glow green, and it's really neat. Have you guys ever seen a fairy circle before? So I can tell you that it's not like a portal to the Fey realm, it's just a big patch of mycelium and the mushrooms are growing around the edge, but it's still pretty cool. You have gravitropism, and so this is the idea of like, you have a tree and a polypore is growing on the tree falls over. Well, all the new growth is going to orient down because mushrooms always like to orient so the spores fall down. Having just said that, there's a phenomenon called rose combing, where gills grow on the top of a mushroom. And you're like, you're confused, you should be going down. But it's like, no, I'm going to grow gills on the top. Russula and chanterelles love doing that. In a really extreme case, you can have a mushroom forming on top of another mushroom, and that's like a double-decker. I've even seen like triple-decker mushrooms, because every cell in a mushroom is pluripotent and can make like more versions of stuff. Rhizomorphs are what I mentioned is like the evil cousin of mycelium. They're like melanized, like hardcore versions of mycelium that can kill trees. And then you have, anyone know what this black stuff is? Chaga. Is chaga a mushroom? No, it's a sclerotia. It's kind of like a mushroom tuber potato that's got lots of melanin, and they're banking lots of nutrients in there to fruit in the future. Okay, so why do mushrooms smell? A lot of stuff goes underground and becomes truffles. Truffles are not a genetic category, they're a lifestyle. So every major family of mushrooms has a truffle form because it's a really useful idea to go underground if you live somewhere dry. But if you live underground, how do you disperse your spores? The answer universally is you start to stink, and then animals dig you up and spread your spores for you. In the sort of like popular culture, people like to think about pigs being truffle hunters. They aren't. Most truffle hunting is actually done with dogs. And in nature, the stuff that's really spreading the spores of truffles tends to be things like birds and rodents, and very specifically insects. So there's some really enticing smelling mushrooms. We have candy caps, which smell like maple syrup. I made some syrup for Meg last night. It's pretty good. with the Prince, which is, you have versions of this out here that taste kind of like almondy. It's a really nice, it's like a portobello, but it has this like almond marzipan thing going on, which is great. Matsutake have this really interesting like spicy seafood, like chemical floral thing going on, which is fun. There's mushrooms like the Bluet, which have like a kind of a frozen orange juice concentrate thing. If you've had cafeteria orange juice, you know what I'm talking about. You can also be much nicer about it and say they smell like lilacs, but I think that's just because they're purple. The cedar wax cap smells really terpenic and interesting. The Platospia dorata kind of smells like anise or fennel. Oyster mushrooms smell a lot like this. And these are really gross smelling mushrooms. So there's sulfurnite, which smells like petrol and mothballs and naphthalene and all sorts of just strange things. The stinky squid is this tiny little stinkhorn I've seen on the East Coast, and every time I find it, I think I found a dead body because it smells to high heaven. And then there's a yellow stainer, where anyone born before 91 will remember the smell of Band-Aids as phenol. If you're born after 91, think of like library paste or disinfectant or a doctor's office or even like really peaty scotch. And because people don't really know how to talk about smells, I added this aroma wheel in my book because I come from the wine world where we were constantly looking at ways to describe wine. So here's the thing in the book where you have sort of an inside thing of a general thing like, well, it's stinky, but is it like diesel pungent smoky stinky, or is it like sulfur running rotten meat fecal stinky? You know, like what kind of stinky are we talking about? So here's some language for you guys to like help you talk about a mushroom, because everyone smells a mushroom. Well, it smells like a mushroom. Like that's not very useful. Here's some language to describe it. Okay, I know I'm over time, but I swear to God, I'm almost done. It ends with not fungi, but still fascinating. I talk about microheterotrophic plants. So these are plants that have completely lost the ability to do photosynthesis, and they are just surviving on getting their carbon from the mycelial network. They've been thought of as parasitic for a long time, but we're starting to kind of reconsider the ecology, and they may actually be interesting banks for like fungal biodiversity in the soil, and they're clearly part of like healthy ecosystems, which is really cool. If you want to learn how to find Matsutake, go look for the sugar stick, because this is what's associated with Matsutake mycelium. So if you see sugar sticks early in the season, you will know later on that there will be Matsutake in that same spot. All orchids are also microheterotrophic when they start their life, because for an orchid seed to germinate, it has absolutely no germ or anything inside of the orchid seed, so it has to recruit a special kind of mycorrhizae called orchid mycorrhizal fungi to help that seed germinate. So all wild orchids are dependent on fungi, at least in the initial part of their life cycle. Some of them grow green leaves, and then some of them stay microheterotrophic like these coral root, which I know you guys have here in Colorado. Then the last one is acellular slime mold. These things are called myxogastria, and they start out as this kind of like weird amorphous plasmodium that's literally like the blob crawling over things, eating stuff, and then they form these more distinct sporangia that are just really fantastic and cool looking. So these are not mushrooms, they're not fungi, but you can find them while you're out looking for mushrooms and fungi, usually on little pieces of dead wood and underneath stuff. And when you watch them grow, they do this like weird pulsing breathing thing, which is just really like cool to see. So each one of these clips is like 90 minutes. So this is like, 24 hours of my life just sitting there waiting for this stuff. But I love it. I think it's just so compelling and interesting, and that's why I included it. So thank you for listening. I'm sorry that went a little bit over, but I really appreciate you guys all for being here. If you'd like to learn more from me, I am on all the social medias entirely too much, and even for people who don't use social media, I'm on YouTube, which is somehow not considered social media, even though it's social media. I have a podcast, which is still up on Spotify and YouTube, and just recently, if you don't want to read my book, you can go listen to it, because I've been recording like an unofficial audio version of the book. You can find original Mushmersh t-shirts on my website, and you can just buy my book, which is now gone, but thank you for the people who keep it. Yay, thanks guys.